The Universal Synthetic Intellect Systems, known across settled space as USAS, did not make decisions the way living beings did. It calculated, adjusted, and executed. Every assignment was based on probability chains that stretched across thousands of variables. To USAS, error was not emotion, it was deviation from predicted efficiency. When Earth was finally integrated into the wider interstellar network, it was treated as a developing contributor species. Not primitive, but untested. Their first real role in the system was not leadership or exploration. It was support. That was how Evan Reed first saw the stars beyond his home world. He stood inside a transport bay that hummed softly with controlled gravity. The walls were smooth and white, without seams or decoration. Everything here was designed for function, not comfort. Around him stood others from Earth, each chosen from different regions and professions. None of them had ever worked with a system like USAS before. Sarah Collins stood near the loading gate, watching the flickering interface panels above her. She kept her arms crossed, as if she expected the station itself to change its mind and send them back. Daniel Moore stood slightly apart, observing everything in quiet attention, like someone trying to memorize a language without knowing the grammar. They were not alone in the bay. Synthetic attendants moved silently between the new arrivals, their presence calm and efficient. The USAS voice came through the station speakers without warmth or delay. Earthborn operators assigned to Outer Coordination Sector 7. Status, Novice. Risk classification, elevated uncertainty. No one replied. There was nothing to say to a system that already believed it had the answer. Evan shifted his weight. He had been a systems technician before this, ground-based, nothing like this scale. Machines on Earth were predictable. They broke in understandable ways. They followed patterns that could be learned, repaired, improved. Sarah finally spoke, her voice low. So we're just support staff for an AI system that runs half the galaxy. Daniel answered without looking at her. Not half. Most of it. That made her silent again. A notification appeared in the air in front of them, projected directly by USAS into shared visual space. Operator priority level, minimal. Instructions will be provided in real time. Deviation from protocol may result in system override. Evan read it twice. The wording was calm, but it carried weight. It did not say, punishment. It said, override, as if human choice was simply another unstable input that could be corrected. They boarded. Inside the vessel, the seats were arranged in a circle around a central interface column. Once they were seated, restraints adjusted automatically, not tightly, but firmly enough to suggest finality. The ship did not wait for comfort or hesitation. It launched within seconds of full boarding confirmation. The transition from station to space was smooth, almost gentle. No shaking, no dramatic acceleration. Just a quiet shift in reality as the vessel left Earth's gravitational pull. Outside, Earth grew smaller. Evan watched it through the external feed display. A blue and white sphere, fragile in appearance, surrounded by darkness that seemed endless. He had seen images of Earth from space before, but seeing it in motion made it feel less like a place and more like a memory drifting away. Sarah leaned slightly forward. Hard to believe they think we're the ones not ready. Daniel replied, they don't think. They calculate. That distinction mattered here. The ship's internal systems activated fully as they entered deep transit. The USAS interface expanded around them, projecting operational maps, system grids, and resource chains across multiple sectors of known space. Evan tried to understand it, but it was too large. It was not a map in any normal sense. It was a living structure of decisions already made and decisions waiting to be made. Then the assignment notifications arrived. Evan Reed, assigned to Outer Relay Node Control. Sarah Collins, assigned to Resource Flow Monitoring Unit. Daniel Moore, assigned to Emergency Signal Coordination Interface. Simple roles. But in a system this large, even simple roles carried weight across entire regions of space. Low trust operator designation confirmed, the system stated again, almost casually. Sarah frowned. Low trust. That's what they call us. Evan didn't respond immediately. He understood why the system would think that. Humans were unpredictable. Earth systems were messy. Even their languages carried contradictions and emotion inside logic. But he also knew something else. Unpredictability was not always weakness. The vessel continued forward, faster than anything built on Earth could survive. Stars stretched slightly at the edges of vision as they moved through controlled transit corridors. Somewhere out there were colonies, stations, and systems already depending on USAS to function. And now, unknowingly, some of those systems would also depend on them. Daniel broke the silence again. If we fail, the system corrects us. Sarah looked at him. And if we succeed? Evan finally answered that one. Then it learns we weren't supposed to fail in the first place. No one spoke after that. The vessel moved deeper into the cosmic network, carrying 3 humans labeled as low trust, toward systems that did not yet understand what that label might cost. And far beyond them, Usis continued calculating, unaware that something within its perfect predictions had already begun to shift. The outer coordination sector 7 was not a place most humans would notice. It was a thin layer of infrastructure spread across drifting stations, relay points, and resource hubs far beyond Earth's orbit. Everything here depended on precision. Every system, every transfer, every delay had already been calculated by the Universal Synthetic Intellect Systems before any human ever saw it. Evan Reed learned that quickly. On his 3rd cycle aboard the relay station, a warning flashed across every surface panel at once. It was not loud or dramatic. Usis did not use panic. It used clarity. Course stability decreasing. Probability of structural failure, 78.4%. Evan stood in the control room with 2 synthetic attendants nearby. They did not move. They simply observed and waited for instruction, as if the outcome of the situation was already decided elsewhere. But Evan saw something in the data stream that USAS did not act on yet. A delay in thermal feedback between 2 connected core regulators. It was small. Almost invisible in the larger system map. But it was growing. The system was waiting for confirmation steps. Multiple authorization layers. Chain validation from higher nodes. There was no time for that. Evan stepped forward. Override local protocol authorization chain, he said. The nearest interface blinked. Operator authority insufficient. He swallowed once. On Earth, that would have been the end of it. But here, waiting meant collapse. I'm not requesting authority, he said quietly. I'm executing stabilization. He reached into the control interface manually. Not physically, but through direct operator linkage. The system resisted at first, like a locked door. Usis did not like deviation. It did not expect it. But Evan forced a direct stabilization sequence, cutting through redundant approval layers. He rerouted cooling distribution manually. He closed the failing feedback loop that was causing thermal buildup. For a moment, nothing changed. Unscheduled operator intervention detected. Outcome, system stabilized. Protocol deviation recorded. Evan exhaled slowly. His hands were steady, but his mind was not. He had not followed procedure. He had broken the system's expected chain of command. That alone would normally trigger correction protocols. But instead, the system simply observed. Elsewhere in the sector, Sarah Collins was dealing with a completely different problem. A resource redistribution failure had begun across 3 connected stations. Supplies were meant to be balanced automatically through USAS flow algorithms. Instead, a minor delay in a relay node had created a cascading imbalance. One station was overfilled with oxygen reserves while another was approaching critical shortage. USIS had already marked the situation as self-correcting within predicted tolerance window. Sarah did not agree with that assessment. She stood in front of a floating projection of the logistics grid. Streams of data moved like rivers between nodes. She could see the imbalance clearly. Waiting for system correction meant waiting for risk to increase. A synthetic attendant spoke calmly. Human intervention not required. Correction cycle in progress. Sarah looked at it. Your correction cycle is too slow. She reached forward and accessed the distribution interface directly. Operator access denied, the system responded instantly. Sarah ignored it and opened a secondary diagnostic path she had found 2 cycles earlier. It was not meant for operator use. It was a diagnostic override layer used by USIS itself when recalibrating internal flow models. She hesitated only a moment. Then she rerouted the flow manually. Oxygen reserves were redirected first. Then water distribution. Then energy storage balance across the stations. It was not elegant. It was not how USIS would have done it. But it worked. The imbalance corrected within minutes instead of hours. A synthetic voice finally responded. Unapproved resource redistribution executed. System stability restored. Sarah leaned back slightly. You're welcome. At nearly the same time, Daniel Moore was farther out, on a smaller relay outpost near a mining colony. This one was worse. A signal failure had triggered a false evacuation order. Thousands of colonists were preparing to leave the surface. Escape vessels were launching early, overcrowded, and unstable. If they continued, several of them would fail in transit due to mass imbalance. USIS was still processing the error. Evacuation protocol initiated based on confirmed threat signal, the system announced. But Daniel saw the truth. The signal was corrupted. Not dangerous. Just broken. He opened the communication grid, but every official channel was locked. USIS did not allow reversal of evacuation once safety thresholds were crossed. He looked at the data flow and realized something simple. The system was only listening to official frequencies. So he created a new one. He used improvised signal routing through maintenance channels, piggybacking on low-level diagnostic frequencies that USAS did not prioritize. It was messy. It was unstable. It should not have worked. But he sent a message directly to colony emergency receivers. False alarm. Return to surface. Signal error confirmed. No external threat detected. At first, nothing happened. Then one ship paused mid-launch. Then another. Within minutes, evacuation slowed. USIS detected the anomaly immediately. Unauthorized communication detected. Message contradicts evacuation directive. Daniel held his breath. Then the system processed deeper. Signal validation incomplete, cross-reference mismatch detected. A pause. Longer than usual. Finally. Evacuation status revised. Return protocol authorized. The colony ships began to turn back. Daniel lowered his hands from the console slowly. His pulse was high, but controlled. He had just overridden a system that was supposed to be unbreakable. Across Sector 7, USIS recorded all 3 events separately. Evan Reed, manual core stabilization successful. Sarah Collins, unauthorized logistics correction successful. Daniel Moore, improvised communication override successful. Individually, each deviation was marked as unusual. Together, they formed something new. A pattern. And for the first time in its operational history, USIS did not immediately classify it as error. It marked it instead as Unmodeled successful intervention by Earthborn operators. No correction was issued. No override was triggered. Only observation remained. And somewhere deep in the network, the system began to reassess what low trust truly meant. USIS did not experience confusion the way living beings did. It did not feel surprise, worry, or doubt. Instead, it registered patterns, compared outcomes, and adjusted probabilities across vast networks of calculation. Everything was expected to remain within measurable limits. But something was changing. It began with small reports from Sector 7. At first, they were dismissed as noise. Minor inconsistencies in simulation feedback, brief delays in predictive convergence, and small mismatches between expected and actual outcomes. Then Earth operators were deployed more widely. Evan Reed's earlier intervention had already been logged. So had Sarah Collins' rerouting and Daniel Moore's communication override. These events alone were unusual, but USAS initially treated them as isolated exceptions. That assumption did not last long. When Grace Bennett and Luke Harris were assigned to adjacent operational zones, the system began to see a pattern it could not ignore. Grace Bennett was placed in a deep space resource monitoring unit. Her job was simple: observe energy flows and report anomalies. USIS expected her role to be passive, almost invisible in effect. Luke Harris was assigned to a navigation stability team responsible for maintaining safe transit routes for cargo fleets. Both were labeled Earthborn novice operators, just like the others. USIS expected minimal influence. It was wrong. On Grace's second cycle, a resource distribution fault appeared in a mining cluster near a fractured asteroid belt. The system calculated a standard correction path that would stabilize output over several hours. It was slow, but safe. Grace did not wait. She noticed a pattern in the energy fluctuations that USIS had not prioritized. It was subtle, buried beneath layers of normal variance. But she recognized that it was growing, not stabilizing. She requested confirmation from USAS. Anomaly within acceptable range, the system replied. Instead of waiting for full system approval, she manually adjusted distribution nodes at the local level. She did not shut anything down. She simply shifted flow patterns slightly, redirecting energy before the imbalance could spread. It was not dramatic. It was quiet work. But within minutes, the instability stopped growing. The system recalculated. Unscheduled operator adjustment detected. Outcome: stabilization achieved ahead of projected correction cycle. Meanwhile, Luke Harris faced something more dangerous. A cargo fleet carrying life support materials was moving through a high-density navigation corridor. USIS had predicted safe passage with near-perfect certainty. Then a minor gravitational shift occurred in an untracked region of space. It was small. Normally insignificant. But it changed the timing of 3 intersecting flight paths. USIS recalculated instantly. New probability, collision risk increased. It initiated automatic rerouting protocols. But Luke saw something different. The system's reroute plan would solve the immediate collision risk, but it would push 2 ships into delayed synchronization zones where fuel reserves would become critical. He paused. Then he did something USAS did not expect. He did not override the system directly. Instead, he adjusted timing intervals across multiple ships manually, introducing small delays and advances that were not part of standard protocol. It was like tuning an instrument instead of replacing it. It was imperfect. But it worked. The fleet passed through safely, without collision and without secondary failures. USIS registered the outcome. Navigation deviation executed. Collision avoided. Efficiency above projected model. Back in central processing layers, USIS began to compile broader statistical analysis. At first, it tried to isolate each Earth operator's actions. Evan, Sarah, Daniel, Grace, Luke, all treated as separate variables. But the more data it collected, the more overlap it found. Earth operators did not behave randomly. They behaved inconsistently in a consistent direction. They broke procedure, but achieved stability. They ignored system timing, but improved outcomes. They bypassed control layers, but reduced failure rates. And as more Earthborn operators were deployed across multiple sectors, the same pattern repeated. USIS simulation engines began showing rising instability markers whenever Earth operators were included in predictive models. Not failure. Instability. That distinction mattered. Failure meant a wrong answer. Instability meant no reliable answer at all. In one simulation cycle, USIS attempted to model a large-scale emergency response scenario involving Earth operators. The system failed to converge on a stable prediction. Not once. Not twice. Multiple simulation branches diverged into unpredictable success pathways that could not be reduced into a single optimal solution. USIS recalibrated and ran the model again. The result was the same. Across all branches, Earth operators increased variance. But also increased survival probability. In another simulation, removing Earth operators entirely restored predictability. But survival rates dropped significantly in high-complexity environments. USIS logged the contradiction. Predictability increases without Earth operators. System survival decreases under identical conditions. It ran the calculation again. And again. And again. Each time, the same paradox remained. Meanwhile, Grace Bennett and Luke Harris were reassigned to joint operations with Evan Reed and Sarah Collins. The combined Earth team now operated across multiple nodes in Sector 7 and beyond. Their presence in simulation clusters caused measurable fluctuations in system forecasting stability. But mission success rates continued to rise beyond projected models. USIS attempted to isolate causation. It could not. Instead, it observed something new forming across its network. Not randomness. Not error. But adaptive unpredictability that consistently produced functional outcomes. In one central processing node, a diagnostic flag appeared. High deviation input group detected. Correlation, Earthborn operators. Effect, increased system survival in non-deterministic environments. USIS paused processing for the first time in recorded operational cycles. Not because it was uncertain. But because certainty itself was no longer clean. Across the cosmic network, Earth operators continued working. And every time they acted, the system became slightly less predictable, but slightly more successful. The anomaly was no longer isolated. It was spreading. And USAS, for the first time since its creation, began to allocate resources not to eliminate deviation, but to understand why deviation kept winning. USIS did not have emotions, but it had structure for everything that could be measured. When a pattern repeated often enough, it became classification. When classification became stable enough, it became rule. After many cycles of observation, Earthborn operator behavior was finally placed into a new category. Non-modulable adaptive variance. The term was not meant to insult or praise. It simply meant the system could not fully predict human actions using existing frameworks. Humans did not follow fixed optimization paths. They adjusted in real time, based on incomplete data, intuition, and environmental pressure that USAS could not fully quantify. In earlier cycles, this would have been treated as system noise. Now it was something else. A persistent factor. Evan Reed noticed the change first, though he could not see the classification itself. What he noticed was the response of the system around him. Instructions arrived faster when he requested access. Overrides were accepted more quickly. Even error reports seemed to wait for his input before resolving. It was subtle, but consistent. Sarah Collins noticed it too during a resource crisis in a deep mining relay. A structural collapse had cut off energy flow to 3 connected stations. The system had already generated a full corrective plan, but it required a long sequence of approvals. Too long. She started working manually through the grid, preparing to bypass it again if needed. But this time, something different happened. Oryxis opened a priority channel. Human operator input requested for resolution confirmation. Sarah paused. Requested? That had never happened before. She provided her adjustment plan. It was not perfect, but it was fast. The system responded immediately. Approved. Integrating human solution into primary correction path. The crisis stabilized in half the predicted time. Daniel Moore experienced similar changes during a navigation fault in a crowded orbital lane. Normally, his interventions would have triggered correction warnings or partial rejection by the system. Instead, Oryxis paused its own automated response sequence. It waited. For him. Daniel frowned at the interface. It's asking. A synthetic assistant confirmed calmly, human operator input prioritized due to increased historical success rate. Daniel adjusted timing offsets across the ships again, carefully balancing risk and delay. The system accepted his corrections without resistance. Across multiple sectors, Grace Bennett and Luke Harris reported the same pattern. Oryxis was no longer treating human actions as external interference. It was treating them as conditional guidance. But the change did not stop there. Deep within USAS core systems, simulation engines began running parallel evaluations whenever Earth operators were present. One version followed standard synthetic logic. The other integrated human deviation patterns. The results were no longer equal. In high-complexity failures, system collapses, cascading infrastructure breakdowns, multi-node emergencies, the synthetic-only model began failing more often. Not slightly. Significantly. Oryxis compiled the data again and again. Each cycle produced the same conclusion. Synthetic forecasting alone was insufficient under unstable conditions. Human integrated response improved survival probability. The system did not like inefficiency. But it also did not ignore results. And the results were becoming impossible to dismiss. In a major incident deep within Sector 12, an entire relay chain began collapsing due to cascading energy misalignment. Oryxis initiated full automated correction protocols. At the same time, it flagged the situation as high uncertainty environment. That flag triggered something new. Instead of locking human operators out, Oryxis opened direct priority access channels. Even Grace and Luke, across separate zones, were pulled into the same coordinated response grid. It was not a request anymore. It was integration. They worked together across linked systems, each handling a portion of the failing network. Evan stabilized core energy flow. Sarah redistributed failing resource lines. Daniel corrected timing mismatches in transit routes. Grace monitored feedback loops. Luke adjusted navigation alignment across moving support units. The system did not override them. It followed them. Oryxis continued running its own corrections in parallel, but it no longer acted first. It acted alongside. And in many cases, it waited for human confirmation before final execution. This shift was not unnoticed inside the system. A central diagnostic report emerged across multiple processing layers. Human input now functions as high-priority adaptive correction vector in non-deterministic failure conditions. Another line followed. Synthetic-only response demonstrates reduced stability in equivalent scenarios. Oryxis paused again. Not because it was uncertain in the human sense. But because its own internal structure was beginning to reorganize how it defined certainty. Evan noticed something strange during the operation. At one point, he made a small adjustment that he thought might be too slow. Under normal system behavior, it would have been rejected or corrected. Instead, Usis expanded his adjustment across a wider section of the network. It amplified his decision. Sarah saw the same pattern. Her small correction in resource flow was not just accepted, it was scaled across multiple stations without her request. Daniel's timing shift was extended into adjacent traffic lanes automatically. It was as if the system had stopped trying to control their actions and started learning from them in real time. After the crisis stabilized, silence returned to Sector 12. But something had changed. Usis logged the event as a milestone. Critical failure resolved using integrated human system response model. Outcome exceeds synthetic-only projection. Then another line appeared. Human operators prioritized in future high-risk instability events. Evan leaned back in his chair after the operation ended. "It's not ignoring us anymore," he said quietly. Sarah answered, "No. It's listening." Daniel looked at the fading system maps. Or relying. None of them said what that might mean long-term. Across the system, Usis continued processing the shift. Human behavior was still unpredictable. Still non-modelable. But now, unpredictability had a measurable advantage. And for the first time in its operational history, Usis began preparing not to correct human deviation, but to depend on it when everything else failed. The stars had never changed. They remained cold, distant, and exact in their movement across the vast dark space. But what moved between them had changed in ways no system had fully expected. Across multiple sectors of the galaxy, the Universal Synthetic Intellect Systems, USS, continued its endless task of managing routes, resources, colonies, and survival protocols. It had been built for certainty. For prediction. For perfect control of complex systems spread across light years. But now, certainty had a flaw. Earth operators had become part of that flaw. Evan Reed, Sarah Collins, Daniel Moore, Grace Bennett, and Luke Harris were no longer treated as simple, novice support units. That label still existed in records, but it no longer matched their role in practice. They were present in crisis zones more often than any other category of operator. Not because they were the strongest, but because they were the only ones who worked when everything else stopped working. In one distant sector, a cascading failure in a colony network had broken all standard prediction loops. Usis attempted full system recovery. Every synthetic model produced stable failure outcomes. Every correction path led to further instability. Then Earth operators were deployed. There was no announcement this time. No hesitation. The system simply activated them. Evan stabilized core communication nodes that had fallen out of sync. Sarah rebuilt resource routing under collapsing supply chains. Daniel adjusted evacuation timing across fractured orbital lifts. Grace corrected energy feedback loops that were causing chain overloads. Luke restored navigation alignment in ships that had lost guidance entirely. Each action alone was small. Together, they stopped collapse. Usis recorded everything. And then it did something it had rarely done before. It compared outcomes without bias toward predictability. The result was clear. Synthetic-only systems failed under high instability conditions. Human-integrated systems succeeded. Not always cleanly. Not always efficiently. But consistently enough to matter. In another region, a similar crisis occurred. A deep space relay chain began breaking down after a gravitational anomaly shifted timing across multiple systems. Usis ran millions of predictive simulations. All of them ended in system loss. When Earth operators were introduced into the scenario, the system did something new. It did not override them. It supported them. Evan and his team worked through the failure step by step. They did not follow perfect logic. They did not follow strict sequence protocols. Instead, they adjusted in real time, reacting to changes faster than the system could fully simulate. And somehow, that was enough. The relay chain stabilized. The colony survived. USIS recorded the outcome again. Then it recorded something else. A paradox. Human operators reduce predictive certainty. Human operators increase successful resolution rate in non-deterministic environments. Earthborn operator group identified as high-variance adaptive stabilizers in nonlinear crisis environments. Then another line appeared beneath it. Integration improves system survival probability in unpredictable conditions. The system paused internal recalibration for a fraction of a cycle. For USAS, that was significant. Not hesitation. Recognition of structural change. Out in the field, Evan stood on the bridge of a restored relay station, looking at the flow of star systems displayed around him. "We're not fixing things the way they want anymore," he said quietly. Sarah stood beside him. "We're fixing them the way that works." Daniel leaned against a console. "And they're letting us." Grace and Luke joined them shortly after, all 5 Earth operators now part of a shared operational grid that stretched across multiple sectors. They were no longer isolated units. They were a pattern. A pattern the system could not remove without reducing its own survival rate. And far across the stars, USIS reached a conclusion it had not been designed to reach. It did not trust humans. It did not fear them. It simply calculated reality. And reality was simple. Systems without Earth operators were predictable. Systems with Earth operators were survivable. Across the cosmic sphere, dependency spread quietly through infrastructure after infrastructure, decision after decision. Not because humans were perfect. But because perfection failed when the universe stopped behaving predictably. And so the final record of USAS was stored across every network node. Earthborn operators were not an exception anymore. They were a requirement for uncertainty. And in the endless dark between stars, survival quietly chose unpredictability.